So our next speaker is Anthony Gritten from the Royal Academy of Music in London. Anthony has co-edited 2 books on music and gesture and has published articles on Stravinsky, Cage and Delois, and on numerous issues in performance studies, including ergonomics, problem solving, empathy, trust, collaboration, entropy and distraction. And today he's going to talk to us about distracted listening, problems, potentials and pragmatics. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you. Sorry about the problem there with the sound. So I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to read a paper to you today, which is related to some other projects I've been involved in. One of these is to do with John Cage and what he was doing in the 1970s, but that's not really the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. But you will see quite a few quotes and ideas of Cage appearing, which is my fault. There is a relation between what I'm going to talk about and 2 other projects I've been doing recently. One is about the nature of the performer's listening and whether what the performer or how the performer listens when she's practicing in the studio or at home or whatever, whether that's the same kind of listening that goes on when she's on stage. And I'm trying to differentiate between these different types of listening and to see where and how things change from the green room onto the stage, as it were. Another project that I've been involved in recently, where some of the stuff comes into this, is about the ideology of corrective teaching that still seems to be quite prevalent in instrumental teaching, particularly in conservatoires, which, as the name suggests, often are lag behind the latest research news. So I'm quite interested in how instrumental teachers often impose certain kinds of constraints upon their pupils and how this might affect what they think they're doing. Anyway, now that we have some sound, perhaps we'll start with listening to these 2 clips. They're too long to listen to in their entirety. But what interests me in terms of distraction is particularly what seems to be the commonality between these 2 clips. So you've obviously heard a bit of both of them already. Both of them are shot through with distraction, at least that's my claim, despite the fact that one of them seeks strenuously to avoid it, which is the pianist playing. We'll hear a little bit of that in a sec. Whereas the other one, which is a performance of a piece by Cage from the 1970s, seeks to embrace distraction, and yet not to fully accommodate or to account for it fully. Anyway. There we are. It's also worth noting, just before I play those 2 clips, that most of the work that has been done on distraction and on cognate terms like interruption and interference in cognitive science tends to have been done around armchair listening, which is fine, absolutely very, very useful, but I'm concerned today with what goes on when the performer's on stage, with what performers seem to be doing when they're listening, which is obviously quite a different kettle of fish, because obviously one of the main features of performing is that you're not just on stage performing, you're also listening while you're performing, and you hear that sort of noise outside while you're playing your instrument or whatever. And I think that adds certain kind of complexity to the account we give of distraction, which has been, or what I might claim, has been omitted from the way we've understood distraction so far. I think it's also interesting, actually, just before I start the paper, the logic of imagery seems to be geared around expertise. So we've already had, yesterday there were 2 occasions when it was mentioned that what we're interested in is how to develop the capacity for mental imagery. And what I'm trying to do with distraction is not to undo that at all, but to suggest that there are some things that come to us unbidden, unbeknownst to all of our plans, and this is a key part of an aesthetic practice that the performer has to engage in. Anyway, let's see if this works. It does get louder, so I think we'll move on, and you can take my word for it that it turns into a piece of music. What I find interesting about this, and I just basically took it off YouTube, isn't just, it happens to be a very beautiful piece played by quite a good pianist, but what's interesting to me is particularly how that whole concert setup, if you like, the dispositif, the apparatus for how performing works in that situation, that cultural situation, is typical of Western classical music. So the whole ideology is about silencing the audience, moving extraneous noises outside of the room, etc., etc., etc. And even Pletnev, who happens to be a very interesting pianist for lots of reasons, is interesting in this sort of early performance because he tends to sit very still at the piano, even when it gets to a much more virtuosic cadenza right in the middle. And then, by way of massive contrast, as you could imagine, is that going to work? Yes? I'm going to talk over this, which is very rude to Cage. But what's interesting about this clip is that it shot through with distraction in a different way. Partly the nature of the piece that Cage wrote is a set of instructions. There's no score as such. The performer's instructed to find materials from the natural world, and these become part of the performance of the piece. And obviously the whole Cagean thing about whether two performances are ever the same, the use of chant, aleatoric techniques, all of that's there. What's also interesting, is, which you won't have heard because it sounds not so loud, is right the way through the first 3 minutes of this performance. Pretty much every performance of Child of a Tree, and you can find about 10 on YouTube. This is one of them. Pretty much all the performances last about 8 minutes, 10 seconds, which is kind of what Cage specifies. But right the way through the first 3 minutes of this, people are coughing and spluttering in the audience, which is a very common thing. You can happen to hear it on the way, where the microphone's placed and all of the rest. But I think that's an interesting thing from a Cagean point of view, because of course noise is something that he was very fond of and very interested in thinking about. And what I'm interested in exploring as well, given that that's the case, how come we can still talk about distraction in an aesthetic like Cage's? You can always talk about distraction when you're playing Balakirev in a silent Western concert hall, but when you're in that sort of performance situation, why is distraction still an issue? Which it is, and it was for Cage. Okay. Some of these things I'm not reading, they're just up there to distract you. So back to the paper, and I'll go through as slow as I can. So, distraction has become increasingly pervasive with the rise of the cognitive capitalist society, the attention economy, the digital turn, the increase in the planet's human population, and the gradual convergence on cities around the world. The seemingly inexorable becoming musical of the world, the stranglehold that sounds seem to have over our daily lives, is a central contributing factor to distraction's ubiquity. It is no coincidence that a recent philosophical theory of sounds defines sound in ways that overlap significantly with how most studies have approached distraction. Namely, and this is the definition that this philosopher gives of sound, sounds are events in which a moving object disturbs the surrounding medium and sets it moving. The extraordinary frequency and extent to which distraction impacts on everybody, both individually and collectively, is shown by estimates of its financial impact. One estimate of the cost of interruptions to the US economy is in the region of $588 billion per year. Another researcher admits that although there are certainly benefits to having access to the rich landscape of spontaneous thoughts for the purpose of creative incubation, problem solving, and goal setting, an inability to focus attention in the face of irrelevant distraction by such thoughts can be problematic. In short, we could debate whether man's infinite appetite for distractions works for human benefit or against it, and I do present evidence on both sides in this talk, but there is no undoing the distraction turn. After all, distraction is as ubiquitous as the performance events into which it intrudes. Consider an example. At the end of his recital in the Wigmore Hall in London on the 13th of November 2009, Marc-André Hamelin's second encore was this piece, Haydn's Fantasy in C major. When he arrived at the first of several general pauses on low unison Gs, those octaves circled there was a short burst of music somewhere outside the building in a broadly consonant key area. Hamelin smiled, raised his head to listen, and the audience giggled. At the next general pause, which is later on, Hamelin waited on the same low notes, perhaps a little longer than he'd done before, as if to signal he was waiting for the same interruption, but the noise failed to happen. The audience laughed anyway, right on cue. This example shows how distraction is both embedded into musical text as a possibility, and yet is always a deus ex machina outside the performer's conscious control. It is a good example of how playing on stage does not preclude listening to noises outside the hall. So how can we understand that the constitution of this kind of performing event is centered on the fact that something happened unbidden, unplanned, unbeknownst to the performer? A summary of the standard answer to this question, given by music pedagogues, is this. This is from Paul Roberts' very good book on Debussy, where he claims that without concentrated listening, the fingers, arms, back, and feet may as well be blocks of wood. As sensible as this seems, and certainly the threat of being wooden when performing drives many pedagogical programs, much of significance remains to be said about concentrated listening, about its relation to distraction, and about whether the performer is as true to her word on stage as she used to claim when she was in the teaching studio the previous week. Curiously, however, distraction is absent from the discourse of performing music, as if there was an unwritten rule that its very name but must not be uttered. This is curious, because as is clear, hopefully later in this paper, although the preferred term used to describe the performer's listening is attention, or a cognate like concentration, absorption, or focus, attention is not the opposite of distraction, as I will argue. Configuring performing in terms of attention is not the same as configuring it in terms of distraction. Both are needed, but they're different things. There are 4 reasons for the relative neglect of distraction in studies of performing. So very quickly, the first reason is the assumption that distraction is marginal by comparison with attention, concentration, and absorption. Thus, in John Mackenzie's meta-theory of performance, which he terms perfumance, this is a seminal text from 2001, which has utterly transformed the way performance studies works, even the central concept of performativity ends up being constrained to having be itself performative, i.e. attentive to the performance task rather than distracted and open to what happens. The second reason for distraction's absence from performing music discourse is that performing music is still bound up with the logic of performance of a text, as opposed to performing from a script, numerous deconstructions by musicologists notwithstanding. There are long-standing cultural reasons for this, such as the institutional setups of music conservatoires, which generally do not encourage students to configure their scores as scripts, having invested heavily in the ideology of corrective teaching. The third reason is that there is a sense in which the concept of distraction comes to performance studies from sociology, where it has a messy, prosaic sense accumulated from the study of cultural spectacles, or from commercial research and development, where it has immediate financial consequences such as greater military success, safer driving, increased consumer spending, or the opposite. The fourth reason is the ruling ideology of silent listening, as you saw in the clip of Mikhail Pletnyov, and full attention, which dominates classical music in particular. As I will argue in this paper, however, distraction reminds us that silence and attention are not facts but ideologies, not givens but tasks, and these have cognitive implications. So I seek to conduct some kind of phenomenological reduction of performing with specific reference to the impact of distraction on the performer's listening when she's on stage. This will include the claim that distraction acts as a kind of temporal switch. I start the reduction by focusing on the complications that arise from listening's constitution as simultaneously central to performing, whoever heard of a performer that didn't listen, and a parallel ongoing process. The performer hears the listeners sniffing at the back. My way into this reduction is via the characteristically seductive noema of sound, as this configures the relationship between desire and cognition in listening. In order that distraction be reduced fully and its constitution as a temporal switch be acknowledged, we need to understand the context in which distraction arises. So, distraction is a contextual phenomenon, always related to an auditory stream into which it intrudes and against which it pushes. Distraction, and in this paper I generally mean auditory distraction, arises and is embodied in many ways according to the local context. A detailed typology of distraction, such as you could get from that list of synonyms earlier, would distinguish between multiple modes of its emergence. Indeed, given that action occurs from within atmospheres that may be distractedly dwelt within, intentionally shaped, barely noticed or felt as an overwhelming presence, it is pragmatic to configure temporal events as coalescing into the multiple drafts model that Dennett has proposed, as a battle of parallel event streams that are riven through with distraction that prevents them from reifying into anything more permanent. Moreover, not only are there multiple modes of distraction, but not all distraction is distracting. Indeed, knowledge can be categorized as useful or distracting according to the task in hand and the nature of the distraction. In certain situations, interruptions cause arousal and stress levels to elevate and attention to narrow, resulting in faster performance on simpler tasks. While, for example, Mackenzie configures the flip side of performance as a black and white matter of failure, perform or else fail, distraction is the grey area in which success drifts into failure and vice versa. Perform or else get distracted. Before moving on to discuss the impact of distraction on the performer's listening, I pause to note a potential obstacle facing a reduction of distraction. Given that some, if not most, distractions pass by either almost or totally unnoticed, and may be non-conscious, since auditory streaming seems not to require conscious attention, with distraction's effects noted and rationalized, but the distraction itself long having run off, as Husserl would say, into the past, how can we recognize and invigorate distractions? One way might be to listen out for distraction in reports of its embodied residues, for example, in accounts of errors, degradation, disruption, suboptimal performance, changes in planning, what psychologists term interruption lag and resumption lag, self-reports of the performer learning from her mistakes, and so on. There are plenty of examples of this in the literature. It is certainly clear that there are many events in which, although it sounds as if a distraction is present, it is as hard for the listener to verify from the outside if this is indeed the case, as it becomes for the performer to remember afterwards if it was the case. Here's an example. On Friday the 9th of May in 2014, Paul Roberts, who was speaking at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama in Cardiff in the UK, finished the spoken part of a keynote address on the pianist as actor and then sat down at the piano. He proceeded to play the first of Liszt's 3 Petrarch sonnets. This is somewhere just before the recapitulation. Throughout the performance, his body was relatively still and calm, and his hands remained close to the keyboard, with one momentary exception, where I've just circled. Just after the chain of descending diminished seventh chords in bar 59, which is the second system there, he raised his head and slightly rubbed his chin, as if there was an itch, before carrying on to finish the piece. Nothing to write home about, possibly. But perhaps this was the embodied trace of distraction that had entered the performance for him somewhere around this point in the music. Perhaps it was nothing more than a physical itch. Perhaps it was the residue of his body's pacing of the movement, reflecting the turning point around the golden section, which, for those of the people that are interested, it's just where that circle is. Perhaps something particular on the sound of the piano in the particular room, the Western Gallery in Cardiff that day, and the acoustics with the audience. Perhaps he picked up something that resonated. Perhaps it was a glimmer of his thoughts on the expressive function of the cadenza at this point in the little piece. Whatever it was, and it doesn't really matter, all of these and other possible descriptions refer to distractions that may have plausibly have arisen to what Larry Spikowski calls a cascade of mental images. The level of distraction and the likelihood of its having an impact on the performer's listening and thus affecting her performing can be divided into various factors. Banbury and colleagues have concluded there are 8 ways in which sounds can disrupt cognitive processing. There they are. Given these sorts of factors, and I'm really just here summarizing a very, very large literature on interruption, most of which you can find in cognitive science, but you also find in ergonomics as a discipline, where there are direct sort of impacts on commercial work. Given all of this, we shouldn't be surprised that cognition is riven with distraction. In fact, distraction should be expected, and Husserl's focus on the accomplishment of intentional acts should really be displaced by focusing on the types of events he found difficult to describe, or which he simply believed were marginal to consciousness. For example, interruptions, delays, incomplete intentions, mistakes, and I would argue distractions. Jonathan Guarneri, for example, is clear about the priority, reversing the standard configuration between attention and self. Attention, he argues, precedes the self and has a greater explanatory power. Michael Marder takes a similar position, analysing attention as some kind of proto-intentionality. Indeed, the priority of attention, or I would prefer to call it distracted attention, is obvious from the millions of little musical events in which distraction does not so much undo or destroy subjectivity in the sense of musical self, but complicates and distributes it. To pause over one example, in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London on the 7th of October 2003, this pianist, Nicholas Hodges, played this piece. This is only the first page, Aeonta by Xenakis for piano and 5 brass instruments. Most of the piano looks like that, as you'd imagine, given that it's by Xenakis. This was the first piece on the programme. While he was performing the first section of this piece, which is about 3 pages that look like that, and it's a solo for the piano, the first section, there were a number of occasions when Nicholas Hodges had to push his glasses back up his nose. They're the glasses. I know because I was there. Had to push his glasses back up his nose during this extended solo section. He seemed to find the time to do so despite the extreme technical demands of the music, which, constructed stochastically, is hardly idiomatic for the piano. It seemed that were he to have not nudged his glasses each time back up his nose, then what was probably a slight distraction on the boundary between non-conscious and conscious thought, or even nothing of the sort, might have become a fully conscious and aesthetically threatening distraction, and a real problem for the continuity of the music, which in the first section has no rest, as you can see, or equivalent places to move your hand away from the keyboard. I think if you think that's a slightly flippant example, I would argue that that's not flippant, and that's a kind of key part of where distraction figures in performing. It was an amazing performance, nevertheless. Now, distraction might seem to be an anomalous subject, and I do apologise for not talking about imagery today. Surely it gets in the way of efficacious and efficient performing, which are Mackenzie's terms for describing performing events in contemporary society. Surely distraction is only a peripheral, minor thing that disappears upon better listening, better training. There is some truth in these claims. For distraction is cunning. It does cause listening to switch direction. It does cause listening to reflect upon itself. It doesn't make new time and doesn't switch listening into a different mode. In this respect, distraction seems to delay performing, to expand time and multiply it and disperse it. Hence, distraction is deplored in so many of the music discourses that have invested in attentive listening. Nevertheless, since it is acknowledged that music communicates critical time dimensions into our perceptual processes, one way in which this happens is surely through distraction. Here, the core phenomenological reduction reaches its core level. Distraction is a temporal switch. How best to describe this phenomenon, this mechanism? So distraction is obviously a temporal event. It's rooted in a temporality concerned with the experience of a never fully present time, distentio. For St. Augustine, at the root of the genealogy of this phenomenology, this described the distracted soul, of course. In our contemporary world, we might note that consciousness can be modulated by focal attention, as Ian Cross and colleagues might say, and that it mobilizes a shared intentionality. This mobilizing is a beginning and a switching. Indeed, distraction, cognitively, seems to always denote some kind of beginning, an injection of energy into the system. Distraction springs up out of events, and notwithstanding its psychological inscription onto attention and later assimilation into listening regimes, its focus all seems to be on what's about to happen, what's coming next. In this sense, as a switch, distraction doesn't really arise within musical events, but between them. It constitutes the nature of the ongoing flow of time for the performer. Husserl, for example, speaks of attentional changes, but distraction, I would argue, is only partly a matter of shifting perspective on the same object. It also concerns the nature of the same object being opened up into something else, not just a validation of a mental schema. So although normally the purely sensory character of perception is usually not at all evident to a perceiver, distraction seems to make the sensory character of listening explicit to the performer, switching the performer back to herself, her body folding back onto itself. In this manner, she is no longer transparent to the music and its meaning, despite everything her teacher wants her to do, no longer an empty vessel for its emergence on stage. Performer and object are set in motion around each other, generating resonance, resisting each other's embrace, and the performers are forced to recall the basic principle that, as Eric Clark writes, the primary function of auditory perception is to discover what sounds are the sound of and what to do about them. So distraction acts like a trap set for listening, a trap for the natural attitude, as Husserl phrases it. It's a temporal device that switches the very strength of attention into its weakness. This switch in energetic investment opens up a temporal discontinuity and writes a new draft of consciousness. The switch loosens up the intentional overreaching that follows the pairing of listener and sound. Thus does distraction for the performer retain a certain contingency and indeterminacy at the heart of this performing event, at the cost of a quicker accomplishment of transcendental subjectivity. In this sense, distraction reminds the performer that attention is a partial, albeit seductive, model for her listening, which can easily trick her into thinking that attention is natural and that the mind is the only thing contributing to what's going on. So distraction has the effect of both temporarily separating attention from its object and drawing the two closer together, such as its cunning and the seductiveness of sound. Following Mackenzie's judicious conclusion, as up here, distraction reveals that the truth of everything emerges through the cracked and uneven joints that bind together performatives and performances. These cracks and unevenness reveal a cunning to the way in which distraction plants switches within the performer's listening and cajoles her into coming clean about the ideological basis of certain listening regimes. This is congruent with the function of distraction as described by the phenomenological reduction. Set in motion by the distraction's temporal switch, attention and distraction work alongside each other to animate listening, as Michael Marder puts it, and to set it in motion towards an appropriate listening regime. What I'm terming distraction, then, is what Marder terms an attentive animation of consciousness, or an attentional regard. Attention requires some measure of distraction, but this is not to say that it is indistinguishable from its opposite. This is an essential point of the phenomenological reduction. Distraction is the first demarcation of consciousness, the switch that opens up the temporality of listening, and thus to pay attention is to make oneself answerable to the demands of the musical object, precisely to give oneself up on stage to distraction. This is, of course, not just a cognitive position that I might be arguing, but an aesthetic ideology of its own. Moreover, given that we know the brain is never truly resting, attention and distraction must be configured as interweaved. If the brain is never in some kind of 0-degree state, then they can't really be opposing forces. Attention being some kind of positive force flowing upwards away from a resting state, and distraction being some kind of negative force flowing in the opposite direction, whatever that might be, since neither attention nor distraction starts switching from a zero-cost base. Distraction's temporal switch makes it difficult to disentangle which moments of listening are grounded in attention and which in distraction. This is the whole point of being on stage. Music has the capacity to call in question the rigid separation of subject and object, and to play with states which don't wholly conform with either the one or the other. So I would argue that the real moral of distraction for the performer is this. Distraction is as strong a force for listening as attention, and in fact the two are co-constituting. The phenomenological reduction should conclude that distraction itself should be replaced by the term distracted attention, or something like that. Thus, while distraction cannot function as the ground for performance practice or an aesthetic, that is to say, while it can't be the telos of listening activity, even Cage's aesthetic isn't grounded on distraction, it's simply more willing to acknowledge it. The rhetoric of distraction nevertheless allows the performer to become more aware of it and to more cognizant of its potential emergence. Final section, you'll be pleased to know. We might ask why the discourses supporting performing music still focus on at best ignoring and at worst eradicating distraction. Why, as I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, distraction is all but absent from the discourse of performing music. Why it is that these discourses insist on ignoring these temporal switches that distraction is, given that doing so only constrains the performer to what she had imagined might happen on stage. The question is why they insist on training the performer not to relinquish too much agency, not to pay attention to external noises like Hamlet and the noise outside the Bigmore Hall, not to wear loose-fitting glasses like Nicholas Hodges, and so on. As if simply not doing such things and remaining bound instead to a legalistic configuration of the concept of attention would guarantee success. What might it mean to configure performing as more centrally configured around distraction as a creative opportunity? What consolation might there be for the performer? For a start, distraction does not impact upon only one type of performing and one type of listening on stage. Its temporal switches work through all forms of listening in all registers, the sensuous embodied as much as the critical and evaluative. These switches are always tethered to sound. As I mentioned at the beginning, the context of distraction is always a temporal intervention, isn't it? These switches are always tethered to sound, to sense data, to what the performer thinks she's hearing. And distraction switches tether the performer to the sounds she's listening to, reminding her that notwithstanding the virtual gestures created by these sounds, she remains physically bound within the world. She is in the hall with the listeners, which is why the structural listening espoused in books like Beyond Structural Listening isn't really forceful enough because it's still dominated by a discourse of expertise. Ignoring that. More broadly, if John Mackenzie's prophetic claim that performance will be to the 20th and 21st centuries what discipline was to the 18th and 19th, an onto-historical formation of power and knowledge, is to have teeth, then it needs to give distraction a more central position, afford distraction and its switches the opportunity to work through listening, and configure this working through as a significantly more vital phenomenon than just the flip side, the failure of attention. Indeed, Paul North's whole trajectory in The Problem of Distraction, which is a fantastic book about distraction, is to argue precisely against configuring distraction and attention as merely opposites. He argues that distraction is a para-ontological relationship of thought to non-being and its variance. So in terms of what John Mackenzie's arguing, distraction is what draws discipline into We need to incorporate distraction more centrally into our pedagogical schemes. For the performer herself, the performer's task is to learn maybe less how to survive distraction and more how to live with it. In this respect, more oral training only helps the performer, for it develops key transferable skills in her auditory domain, developing a familiarity with temporal switches and a confidence in apprehending distraction and their varied modes of intrusion into her listening. This is, I think, a very interesting slide. This is two military personnel sitting in Langley, Virginia, flying drones 6,000 miles away, bombing the hell out of somewhere or other. And it's interesting, there's a lot of research been done, both not just in the military, about distraction obviously in flying and many forms of kind of transport. There's a lot been done about drone flyers finding it stressful and distracting, being stuck there for 12-hour shifts while they're flying these drones. I just think it's ironic given the nature of the world as it is. So there you are, little point made. As Vego and Zaidan conclude, a sense of peace and quiet in the mind is proposed to arise through mental training and concentration, non-conceptuality and discernment, in contrast to the untrained, frenetic restlessness of mental time travel that characterizes the postmodern setting. So by developing oral skills, conceived broadly beyond the imitation and reproduction tasks that quite understandably dominate educational curricula in conservatoires and universities, the performer's ability to react prudently to distraction develops in tandem. Cage, once again, seems to have been an early adopter of this idea, as you can see. There is perhaps an essential truth here about performing and the impact of distraction upon listening. As Cage writes elsewhere, and I do apologize for all these Cage quotes, they're just there because they're neat. What is being fooled? Not the ear, but the mind. So what should the performer do? What should she do, given the omnipresent potential of distraction to intervene in her listening? She should breathe, trust her ears, and engage all her senses equally. Her performing is open to distraction precisely because, in the contemporary world, expertise and intentionality have, one might say, been reconfigured, downgraded perhaps in the body's list of priorities, and listening has come to take the top spot. We might rewrite Darwin and say, survival of the best listeners. This is not to say that anything goes for the performer. It is simply that something will come to pass when she's on stage, and it's pretty futile to attempt to predict exactly what's going to happen. Performing in general should now be entirely future-facing, open to what might happen, and no longer concerned with either returning to close the backward-facing circle of representative fidelity or with fetishizing technical adequation to a set of mental projections. Pedagogy, in other words, needs to grow up. What might be lost, then, from not acknowledging the impact of distraction on the performer's listening, from not acknowledging that attention is in fact always distracted attention, from not acknowledging that the temporal switches of attention driven by distraction could in fact be productive? There will, after all, always be someone digging about noisily outside the concert hall, whether in a fictional context or outside the Wigmore Hall, and the performer has nothing to lose from acknowledging that this is the case and taking that into account on stage. Oral training for the performer is at the heart of her development, obviously, and done carefully, it can teach her not to listen less or more, but to listen more patiently and openly to what happens while she's performing. She may be delayed, but if the performer opens her ears to distraction, then she may just find herself marveling at what happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony, about this very interesting perspective on distraction. And we have some time for some questions. Yes, Mats?
Yeah, thanks very much for this thought-provoking presentation. You gave this overview of the different types of distraction that can happen while listening to music, and if I understand you correctly, you also, what you said at the end, so distraction is a necessary component of an aesthetic experience as well in some kind. And you can one can distinguish, I think, between external distractions, ambulance, coughing, and internal distractions. Do you distinguish between the two of them? Is there any qualitative difference, or is there any difference between the two, or would you say there's equal?
I think they are different things, and I think it is important to distinguish between them. Qualitatively, qualitatively. I think the difference is largely marked by aesthetic preference, the cultural context. So if you're, like in the examples of the noise coming from outside the concert hall, I think that has a cultural evaluation that comes before the performer goes on stage. So if you go on stage and you sit down to play that Balakirev, the idea is that there won't be sounds coming in from the outside. There may be, there may not be. But the idea of internal distractions is something that can't be avoided and that has a different kind of like valence because it's only something the performer may respond to. Nobody knows what's going inside the performer's head or how they're hearing at all. So there's a different kind of phenomenology to how internal distractions are dealt with by the performer. And I mentioned somewhere, or maybe it's a section I'd taken out, about the problem for looking at the phenomenology of distraction, for describing it, which is that lots of distractions go by unknown to the performer. That doesn't mean they're not distractions, but it creates a problem for us if we're seeking to create an account of what distraction might be, because there are so many things that go through the head, which are in the conventional pedagogical sense not part of the performance plan, but that doesn't make them a vital part of what's going on stage, whether it's body regulation, whether it's kind of various kinds of feedback, proprioceptive or whatever. So there is a nuanced typology, I guess you could draw up, of internal distractions. In a way, I'm focusing on the much more vulgar external distractions because they kind of get the ball rolling with the idea of what distraction might be. The more interesting ones are the internal ones, but they're much more difficult to account for. I've no idea how you would measure them, for example, empirically. When you can look at accounts, as I mentioned, of failure and of performers looking back over what they do, but there are so many problems scientifically with looking at what the performers like self-reporting accounts of what was going on in their head. I mean, that's just an old problem.
Any more questions? Yep.
I could have spoken up. Would you mind telling me a little bit about this chess picture while you were showing it? There was one in your talk where you had this the chess playing.
The chess one. So yeah, that one.
One. Was that shown because of being distracted from the other one, or what the wires are meaning there? So I'm quite interested in that.
So this is John Cage on the right, Marcel Duchamp and his wife Teenie, and this is 1968 in March in Toronto in Ryerson University. This was a public performance event, and they played a game of chess together. As you can see, the chessboard was actually wired up to a set of speakers, and every time they moved, it set sounds off. So it was a sort of, in theory, a sonic event. Okay. There were also three electronic composers, including David Tudor and Gordon Mummer and David Behrman, in the background manipulating sound. So it wasn't, as with Cage, things were never as simple as it seems. But this is one of the documentary photos that a Japanese sculptress took of the event. I think what's interesting in terms of distraction, I like the photo anyway, but what's interesting in terms of distraction is the multiplicity of modes of engagement with that event, not just because it's more than one person doing something, but because things are not determined by what they do. So the whole point of the way the music was composed in the event was that they played chess according to the rules of chess. And in fact, Duchamp started without a knight because he was so much better than Cage. Duchamp was in fact in the top 5 grandmasters of chess in America in the last 20 years of his life. He was a pretty good player. So they played chess, and although it was set up that they thought things were going to change in terms of the sound every time they moved, things were then changed inadvertently by the nature of the electronic system, the circuits that had been set up by the 3 composers at the side of the stage. And this went on for this piece, or whatever you want to call it, this event lasted for about an hour and a half, and Cage lost the game. They then started a second game. They drank we can't see, but they were drinking wine. They finished the bottle of wine, got halfway through the second game, gave up, and then finished back a couple months later in Duchamp's flat in New York. So it's obviously one of those things. I just think it's interesting because it sets distraction onto a much more complex field than just a pianist and a piece of music which has a score. But key to where Cage came into used distraction and got into distraction was in fact his friendship with Duchamp, which I suppose for me is why that picture's quite an interesting document of that. So Cage knew Duchamp since about 1943. Duchamp was about 25 years older than Cage. And Cage went to Duchamp's flat in New York for about 10 years in the late 50s and into the 60s, learning how to play chess. Of course, he wasn't really there for chess. He was there to talk to Duchamp, but he did learn to play chess. And they collaborated on a couple of other projects as well. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it's partly to do with the genealogy of distraction that, for me, is interesting in terms of Cage. I've been involved in other projects doing research into Cage, which for him comes from Duchamp, so it's just a reflection on that.
Yes, Ralph?
Thank you. One question. It seems to me from your talk that there is a hidden motive which you really haven't entered into, namely a kind of authoritarian, idealistic conception of purity, that you are supposed to have a pure experience, since you say no distractions, please. And two things come to mind. One thing is, since you went into Husserl, parts of Husserl could be interpreted in a very idealistic, pure way. I'll just leave that out, but rather talk about the cultural aspect of this, that we have cultivated this purity of the concert experience. You are supposed to behave in a certain way, and if you don't behave, you are thrown out of the concert hall. And that has furthermore been strengthened, paradoxically, by parts of the avant-garde thinking of the music of Lachermann, for instance, which is very fragile. If you just push a chair in the midst of some cello sound, you are confounded. Is this the chair sound or is it the cello sound? So, in other words, there is this kind of move towards the absolute pure, which I find quite troubling, and also it's very cultural. I cannot imagine other musical cultures doing the same. So, thoughts of that?
Shall I just quickly, I agree with the Husserl point, absolutely, I need to think about that. The cultural thing, you're absolutely right, there's a sort of authoritarianism about certain cultural practices, and I suppose other things I've written on distraction do go into that a little bit, I suppose, but for me the point would be to use distraction to unpick some of that, but then you'd have to ask, well, which, I mean, all these pictures up here are very nice, but they're all completely different aesthetics, completely different performance practices. You know, having Balakarev played in Moscow versus Cage in Norway versus this thing in Toronto, they're very different practices within themselves. So I'd say what you raise is a very interesting point, and I'd have to look at it in terms of whether particular performance practices needed unpicking in a particular way. For me, the interesting thing about distraction is it offers a sort of a multi-purpose tool for unpicking authoritarianism or whatever you want to call it, especially if you go down the typology of what constitutes internal auditory distraction, and whether sound itself has certain properties that make it distracting. That would seem to undo the claims by Lachermann or whoever that certain things have got to work in certain ways. I mean, maybe composers are destined to argue against distraction. Maybe that's their job. The performers are there to undo some of these claims.
Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions. We need to go out for a coffee break. We need to get some fuel to continue the day, but we will be back at 11:30, 25 to 12, to have some time to eat and drink the coffee. And we'll come back with the next talk.